here on Sunday nights, and I just kind of got that urge. And there's 2 or 3 books we avoid in the Bible quite a bit, and Revelation is one of those books. Revelation, Song of Songs, not books we preach a lot of sermons over as a rule. But it's an interesting book. It's something that's there for us to glean from. And this evening, I just want to give us a little background and a little idea about the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is attributed to the Apostle John, and the scripture that was just read about things that will soon take place is how that starts. And I believe as we look at some things about the book of Revelation and some historical background, it kind of helps us to understand a little bit more about what's actually going on. I don't know why I don't have a slide. About what actually is going on. There's several different views of the book of Revelation, and if I can get this out of my pocket. And I don't know if you're aware of that. It depends on how we look at it, and it depends on our doctrine and basically our theology of how we take this book to mean. And there's 4 main views, but most of these you could split off 100 different ways. But this is kind of the 4 big things, way people look at the book of Revelation. And the first one, we call them preterists. And preterists are people who basically believe that the book of Revelation has basically already taken place. In other words, it's more historical than it is revelation or prophetic. Preterists are often called amillennialists. And we talk about that a little bit. Last Sunday night, we talked about the 1,000-year reign, Revelation 20, and that's kind of a big part of the book of Revelation and something that is kind of pivotal and things focus on. And if you listen to a lot of radio, like maybe religious radio, like Bott Network or people like that, a lot of those preachers, they really propose the millennial view, and we'll talk about that a little. Amillennialists basically believe that the millennial reign has either already occurred or we're in the middle of it. There's 2 different ways you can kind of look at that. Historicists, and there's several great theologians over the years that we call historicists, and they really take it as really describing just a long chain of events from John's time all the way to the end of history. They don't really take it as being a specific time or it's going to happen in the future, but they kind of take it as a long string of events. And that's something I'm going to look at a little. I never really looked at that much as we study Revelation, but in the 7 churches of Asia, people are historicists. They take every church to represent a specific period in church history that's going to carry on to the end of time. Futurists, they place it at the end of times, and we call those people generally premillennialists. And what that means is that 1,000-year reign in Revelation 20, they don't believe that that's occurred yet. They believe that's yet to come. We call them futurists. They take the book of Revelation to be prophetic. And I'll give you some graphics that'll help you because I know it's kind of confusing, and I'm going to try to go really slow. So we'll try to go slow. The other group of people are people who are called idealists. And idealists don't take anything in the book of Revelation except maybe the first 3 chapters as being, and even that most of them don't take as being actual. Idealists take it as being basically an idea. In other words, it's something that would be reoccurring to the end of time. Evil rises up, Satan rises up, bad things happen, good triumphs, and then we repeat the cycle over and over and over again. Idealists, those people take things that have happened throughout world history, like World War II, or other events throughout history, as being part of that cycle. Hitler is evil. Hitler was destroyed. Hitler could be the Antichrist. The rise of the Roman Catholic Church and influence of the Roman Catholic Church. A lot of people have taken Revelation to mean that over the years. Idealists, that basically the Roman Catholic Church is the harlot, and that was what Revelation was written about, was in response to Catholicism. And so those people really don't take Revelation to be about anything specific, anything concrete. Because realistically, The book of Revelation mentions no time period, no people by name, no empires by name. So their idea is this could fit any time, almost like a parable of Jesus. It could fit any time, any place. Idealists. And if we break those groups down a little bit, I was raised as a futurist as a child, a premillennialist. That was my what I was raised up in. Matter of fact, I handed out many pamphlets over my childhood that said, "Are you ready for the rapture?" I remember handing those out when I was a kid, going door to door, handing out pamphlets that said, "Are you ready for the rapture?" As a child, I was raised to be a premillennialist, and premillennialism basically focuses on that passage in Revelation 20, and it basically thinks that it's primarily about the end times. Premillennialism gives the idea that there's going to be an earthly reign of Jesus, and that's what you hear from most contemporary Christian evangelists today. If you listen to the radio, this is their view of the book of Revelation, is that it's yet to occur. And it really is based on that 1,000-year reign and Satan being loosed and the other things that go on. It's based on the idea that Jesus will return and that there'll be a reign of Christ upon the earth. And it focuses around what you've probably heard, the rapture. And the rapture is the idea that the people who are righteous in God will be raptured away before the tribulation. The idea is that we won't have to go through that. So premillennialism is based on the idea, number one, and there's a lot of different views of premillennialism. It's what makes it so confusing. But it's basically based on the idea that Jesus will rapture away the church, that there'll be a period of tribulation, and a battle will be waged. The battle of Armageddon will be waged upon the earth, that Jesus is going to defeat Satan, and he's going to set up an earthly millennial kingdom for 1,000 years upon the earth, a literal 1,000 years. That's why we call it millennialism. And there's several different ways that that's viewed, and I know that's not a real bright graphic, and I tried to brighten it up some, and it really didn't help a whole lot. But the basic premise of this theory is that Jesus put the church in place as a stopgap measure because basically he was rejected by Judaism. He didn't accomplish everything that he should have accomplished. And because of that, he set up the church as like a stopgap measure to hold us in place for this indeterminate period of time that we're in the middle of right now. And then at the end of this indeterminate period of time, 1 Thessalonians 4 will occur. The angel will come, the rapture will come, the dead in Christ will be raised to be with Christ. A period of tribulation, a battle of Armageddon, and then a millennial reign of Christ upon the earth. And after that millennial reign of Christ upon the earth, then that will be the end. That's kind of the idea of millennialism, or premillennialism, we call that. Amillennialism, or futurist, what we talked about in that respect, is the idea that there's really two different views of that. One is that the millennial reign spoke about in Revelation 20 is occurring right now. It's the church. In other words, we're in the 1,000-year reign, figuratively. We're in the 1,000-year reign right now. And at the end of that 1,000-year reign, at that point, Jesus will come again, and the church will be turned to God, and the earth will be destroyed, and that will be the end of times. That's one view of amillennialism. The other view is that the 1,000-year reign has already occurred, that's not necessarily a literal 1,000 years, which is the view I'm going to hold and the view we're going to talk about, that it's not a literal 1,000 years, that it's the idea of a perfection of reign with Christ, and that in one view of that is that that's already occurred. And that's really a preterist view. The idea that most of these things have occurred, most of these things have already taken place. What does the book fit? That's a question we're going to have to answer. We're not going to answer that tonight, but we are going to answer it. What best fits the book of Revelation? What of these views best holds to the book, to the text, to what's being said? And we're going to have to look at that a little bit. So preterists basically take this to be two different things. If you're a preterist and you think the book of Revelation predominantly has already occurred in history, there's two different views about that. The first view is that the book of Revelation is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That was a real prominent view 40 or 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Very prominent, especially in the church. There's a Church of Christ preacher that I think a lot of, and most of you might have never heard his name, Foy Wallace. And Foy Wallace was a great espouser of the destruction of Jerusalem, wrote a big book on it. I really admire him, and I've read a lot of his stuff. I don't really agree with him on this, but I do admire him, and I admire what he wrote about that. And it was a very prevalent view for a long time, is that the book of Revelation was written about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And that's a real prominent view of preterists. The other thing that preterists believe is that it's predominantly about the Roman Empire, about the persecution of Christians under the Caesars, about emperor worship, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, and about things that happened under Rome. So that's another view, is that, okay, either it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, or it's talking about the destruction of Rome, talking about the Roman Empire. So as you can see, there's a lot of very varying views about how people look at the book of Revelation. And over the course of history, those views have changed. Things that have been popular at certain points of history are no longer a popular view of the book. 100 years ago, the popular view of the book of Revelation was that it was about the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope was even called the harlot, right? It was a very prominent view, and if you were in the church 40 years ago or 50 years ago, you probably heard that view. So that was a prominent view. But on the other hand, if we go back to this preterist view, what does a book fit? What does the book fit? Well, we got to figure that out. We have to figure that out. So we kind of need to know about the Caesars, because it's kind of important in Bible history. The Caesars, they were important. Nero was Caesar at the time of Jesus, 54 to 68 BC, or after Jesus. Nero was the emperor that persecuted Christians. He's the one we first really begin to talk about when we talk about Roman emperors, was Nero. Nero was emperor when Rome burned. If you ever remember that statement, right, that the emperor fiddled or Nero fiddled, why Rome burned? Well, that was Nero. And because of that, Nero blamed Christians for Rome burning. And because of that, the persecution of Christians really came into focus under Nero. Before Nero, Christianity was tolerated. They were there. The Romans really didn't care about them. It was just kind of there, and it was all right. But during the reign of Nero, Christianity became under severe persecution. And many Christians were killed during the reign of Nero. The Flavius empires, Galba, Otho, and Aulus, they were short-lived at best. As you can see, Galba started in 68, and Aulus, or Vitellius, he ended in 69. So those three emperors are almost insignificant. They reigned for such a short period of time, it was almost insignificant. Vespasian, on the other hand, was long-lived. And it's under Vespasian that Rome will be destroyed. And that's a big thing. The destruction of Rome in 70 AD. And although Vespasian ordered that destruction because of the revolt that was occurring in Jerusalem, he wasn't really responsible for it. It would be the next emperor, Titus, who actually seized Jerusalem and actually led that campaign. It was Titus who actually was the one, although he was an emperor at that time, it was Titus who actually went and seized it. Titus was Vespasian's son. So he was the one that actually led that campaign against Jerusalem, actually led that attack, and led to the fall and the destruction of Jerusalem. Flavius says that there were as many as 1 million killed during the destruction of Jerusalem. It was terrible, unbelievable bloodshed, like nothing that had ever been seen. And that's why a lot of people really think that Revelation deals with the destruction of Jerusalem, was because of the tremendous bloodshed and persecution against Judaism that happened at that time. But does that really fit the book? Titus then came into reign, but Titus in our Christianity is not as significant as Domitian. Domitian is the one who will banish John to the Isle of Patmos. Most scholars believe, most people believe, it was Domitian. Historically, it says that Domitian tried to boil John in a vat of oil, and John didn't die. And Domitian says, what can we do with him? We can't kill him, so we'll banish him to the Isle of Patmos. A lot of people who think that Revelation deals with the destruction of Jerusalem, you have to put John in Nero's reign in order to do that, because you have to get pre-70 AD. And if we put John in Nero's reign, the inevitable question arises, why didn't Nero just kill him? Because Nero is responsible for killing Peter. Nero is responsible for killing Paul, right? Why didn't Nero just kill John? Well, a lot of people think that points to the idea, and we'll look at some historical evidence, that John was imprisoned or John was exiled during the reign of Domitian. So that kind of dates our book. And that's important, because if Revelation's about the destruction of Jerusalem, then Revelation has to be written before the destruction of Jerusalem, which is 70 AD. So it becomes really, really important. When did John write it? When did John write the book of Revelation? Dating of the book becomes important to us in our discussion, because if it's 68 or 69 AD, which is Nero, then we could be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But if it's 96 or later, which is Domitian, then chances are, well, realistically, it can't be about the destruction of Jerusalem, because by that point, Jerusalem has already been destroyed. One of Foy Wallace's big arguments about that was that if it was written not about the destruction, it was written after the destruction of Jerusalem, why wouldn't the destruction of Jerusalem be mentioned? It's such a big event in Judaism. Why wouldn't it be mentioned in the book of Revelation? So that's an argument that a lot of people use that say, well, maybe it is about the destruction of Jerusalem. But I think the date of the book can't be that early. And there's reasons for that. If you've been in my church history class, we talked about a guy by the name of Irenaeus. And Irenaeus was one of the early church fathers. And Irenaeus wrote a book called the Book of Heresies. Irenaeus was really fighting a guy by the name of Valentinus. Valentinus was a Gnostic. And Irenaeus was really fighting against him, and he wrote this book, the Book of Heresies. He lived in 180 AD, which isn't too long after Christ. He was a student of Polycarp, which is really important, because Polycarp was a disciple of John. When John was in Ephesus at the end of John's life, Polycarp was one of John's disciples. So Polycarp knew a lot about John. So it's a really early reference. Matter of fact, traditionally, people say that Polycarp was one of the children who came and sat on Jesus' lap. Traditionally, when Jesus said, forbid the children not to come unto me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs unto such as these. Traditionally, Polycarp was said to be one of the children who came to Jesus. Now, we don't know if that's true or not, but I always think that's a really interesting thing. Was one of the ones that came and sat on Jesus' lap. And so Polycarp was very early, a disciple of John. And he says it was not very long ago, almost in our own generation, at the close of the reign of Domitian, and that's from Irenaeus' book Against Heresies. The testimony of Irenaeus not far removed from the apostolic age. He places the book near the end of Domitian's reign, and he died in 96 AD. So it kind of helps date it. So that's what we have to look for. How do we know when the book was written? Revelation's tough, because unlike a lot of books of the New Testament, where it made historical reference to figures of the day, like somebody was in power or somebody was reigning, or he was emperor or ruler over this. We don't have historical reference in the book of Revelation. John doesn't provide it. So you have to look for other sources to date it. And those sources tend to be historical sources, early historical. Clement of Alexandria says that John returned from the Isle of Patmos after the tyrant was dead. And Eusebius, known as the father of church history, we talked about him in my class, identifies the tyrant as Domitian. So a lot of early historical things tell us that it was during the reign of Domitian, and that puts it about 96 AD. And if that's the case, we kind of got to take that destruction of Jerusalem idea and we kind of got to put it to the side, because I don't think we can support that with the date of the book of Revelation. So we kind of got to set that to the side. Even though it was a really popular view at one time, and a lot of books were written about that, I think we kind of have to set that off to the side. As was said, this book was written to the 7 churches of Asia. In Scripture, it's always important to us to ask a really important question when we look at the Bible. It's something you really need to ask yourself when you study Scripture. And that's a really simple question. Was this written to us, or was it written for us? That's a really good question, because it matters a lot. There's a lot of things in the Bible that simply weren't written to us. They weren't. They were written for us, but they weren't written to us. Some things in the Bible were written to us, right? They were written to us, to the church, but a lot of things weren't. So we have to ask that question with the book of Revelation. Was the book of Revelation written to us 2,000 years later, written to me and you in our day, something we're still looking for? Or was the book of Revelation written for us? Well, let's ask a question. Who is the book of Revelation addressed to, right? Well, it's pretty plain, isn't it, if we read the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation was addressed to the 7 churches of Asia, to those 7 churches. Not to us, not to the church in Henrietta, not to Rex 2,000 years later. It was written to those churches. Why? Why was it written to those churches? Why did all of a sudden God give a revelation to 7 churches of Asia? These 7 churches are in modern-day Turkey. Matter of fact, we got to visit them on our trip to Italy, or one of them. And now is in Turkey. We went to Ephesus now, which no longer is called Ephesus. But we went to Ephesus, got to see the ruins of Ephesus. It was very, very impressive, I got to tell you. And hopefully I can share some pictures of that as we talk about that church in Ephesus. If you look at these 7 churches, there's other churches in Asia Minor besides these 7 churches. There's other churches that exist within this realm besides these 7. But these 7 form kind of a circular loop. And if you were to start and follow that loop around, it's about 256 miles. So it's not a big geographic area. If you went from Laodicea to Ephesus, straight across, is only about 100 miles. So it's not a really, really big geographic region. But it was written to these, particularly to these 7 churches. And so another thing we have to ask ourselves when we look at the date of Revelation is, what about these churches? And I kind of want to end it with this tonight. It was wrote to the church in Ephesus. It was not founded by Paul until the latter part of Claudius' reign, about 61 A.D. And instead of approving them for any one of love, he commends them for their love of faith. In Ephesians 1:15, he commends them for being faithful and being loving. Yet when Revelation is written, they said they had left their first love. So that kind of says time's passed. So if 61 A.D. Is that the book of Ephesians written in 61 A.D., it kind of tells you a period of time. These churches had matured for several years, maybe decades, between the time Ephesians was written and the time the book of Revelation was written. We see a maturity in these churches. They've grown, they've left their first love, they've matured. A period of time's taken place. And I think that also speaks for the latter date, the 96, 97, 100 A.D., after 96. Another intelligible evidence is penned by John, was banished to Patmos. And it's well known that Domitian had a fondness for this type of persecution. If, however, the persecution dated in the time of Nero, how does one account for the fact that Peter and Paul are murdered, and yet John is only exiled to an island? You know, Nero, if you remember this, if you know this, Peter died how? Peter, according to tradition, Peter was crucified upside down, right? Paul was beheaded, and that was because they were in Rome, and Peter wasn't Roman. If you weren't Roman, you were crucified. Paul, if you remember from the text, Paul was Roman, right? Paul says, I'm a citizen. Remember he's having that argument, and he says, well, I obtained this. The centurion said, I obtained that at a great price, and Paul said, I've been a a citizen since birth. I've been a Roman since birth. So because of that, Paul was beheaded by Nero. And since Peter was not Roman, Peter was crucified by Nero. And according to tradition, Peter said, I refuse to be crucified like my Lord. So according to tradition, Peter was crucified upside down because he wasn't Roman. But that was Nero. Nero was killing Christians, persecuting Christians after Rome burned. And that was the persecution that happened. Andrew, according to tradition, was crucified on an X-shaped cross. We call that Andrew's cross. I'm just giving you that for free tonight. On an X-shaped, we call that Andrew's cross. It's X-shaped cross. Yet John is only exiled to an island, right? And then consider this fact. The church at Laodicea, and we're going to talk about these churches, is represented as existing under conditions of great wealth. She was rich and had need for nothing, Revelations 3:17 says. And yet we know historically in AD 70, Laodicea was destroyed by a great earthquake. So the chances of Laodicea being a great city of wealth that had need of nothing after being destroyed by an earthquake before 70 AD would be pretty remote. It would have required more than 8 or 9 years to have risen again to the state of affluence described in the book of Revelation. So there's evidence that Revelation was written in the 90s, and because of that, we kind of have to reject the idea that it was about the destruction of Jerusalem. So once again, there's 4 views of Revelation. We're going to talk about this, which fits. There's the preterist view, amillennialist, the idea that most of it has already occurred, either the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of Rome. It has to do with the Roman Empire. Those are the predominant views. Historians, who say it's just a long chain of events to the end of history. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Futurists, who thinks that we're in a premillennial age. We're waiting on Revelation 20 to occur. It hasn't occurred. The Revelation is predominantly a prophetic book, and that most of these things haven't happened yet. That really come out in the 70s. Actually, there was a guy, if you're interested in researching all this, I don't know if you are or not, but there's a guy wrote a book, Valverde wrote a book, The Late Great Planet Earth. He was a member of he was in the Dallas Theological Seminary at the time. He wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth in the early 70s, and that book really espoused the futuristic view. And if you've ever read the Left Behind series, if you've ever seen that mentioned, that's about the same idea, premillennialism. So it's a real popular view today, started really in the 60s and 70s being predominant, but it's a real popular view today, premillennialist view, premillennialism. And then once again our idealists who view it as just a symbolic picture of time that will be reoccurring, the battle of good over evil, good over evil, good over evil. It's going to happen over and over and over and over again till Jesus comes again. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea, a little preview of what we look at when we start to look at this book. We start to try to ask ourselves some questions. What does it fit? What does it fit? What are we going to take? What view are we going to hold? Can we back it up? And I hope that it's not too confusing. I hope I'm going slow. I hope that you kind of get an idea that there's a lot of different ways we look at the book of Revelation. Have for centuries. This isn't anything new. For centuries, people have looked at it in a lot of different ways. So as we begin this, how are we going to look at it? What are we going to take to be our clues, our evidence of how we need to take this book? And I hope I can help you with that. And we're going to look at the 7 churches of Asia. And we'll look at that. And we'll look beyond that at a lot of these references that are made. There's a lot of books. If you want to study this more, I have a lot of them, but there's a lot of books you can read, a lot of reference I can give you. It just depends on how much time you want to spend studying this. If you just want to listen to me, that's fine too. I'll give you my best take on it and what I believe on it, which has morphed over the years a lot, I might say, and even in the last few years, some of my views of Revelation have morphed somewhat. So I'll be happy to share my views with you. You're welcome to disagree with me, and that's fine. So this is something we can agree to disagree about and leave friends and Christians, and the world's a good place. So hopefully it'll be a fun study. I don't want you to be scared of the book, because I think people are. I don't want you to be scared of this. Jesus wouldn't give us something, inspire something to us that would scare us to death, I don't believe. I don't think he needs to do that. So let's have fun with this, I hope. Thanks for your attention this evening. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand.